Hey everybody, Ryan here. Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios and to what should be a relatively quick edition of Sound Check. Today, we're taking a gander at Otto Audio's latest little bundle of distortion joy, the Blown Out Wall pedal. Otto Audio's previous plugin release with the 1111 amplifier was surely disruptive and disgusting enough on its own, but now we have the blown out wall to complement it, or indeed any amplifier plugin that you choose to use it with, though this does pair very well with several of the modes and indeed the cabinet simulations on 1111. So I'm going to be sticking to that for the most part, outside of a couple of very specific demonstrations. Now, this is intended to go in front of an amplifier of any type of tube amplifier simulation, and obviously with that you need a cabinet sound as well. Though on one demonstration I'll show that if you want to get a little cheeky and creative, using this with just a tube power amp emulation and a cabinet sound is enough to get you started, because the circuit that's under this digitized pedal box is pretty remarkable at dialing in vastly different distortion textures. The 1111 on its own is already great, and of course you can do all sorts of pre-EQs and different distortion effects on top of it to get different textures and tones, but there's only so much you can do with that. You're never going to get that gated, spitty fuzz sound, or chainsaw, Swedish death metal sound, or indeed a big blown out wall, and that's exactly the idea behind this pedal design. As I spoke with Reed from Otto Audio, and apparently he was on a bit of a voltage-starved and Velcro textured fuzz and crazy pedal circuit kind of kick, and he decided to put those kind of sounds into a plugin that everyone could enjoy, and I think mission accomplished here. If you've heard demonstrations of this before, or even just listening to my introduction demo, you might think this is some highly modified HM2 circuit, but it's actually not. It has some similarities, of course, in the overall texture and the frequency response tricks in play, but there is not a single chunk of HM2 circuitry in here. Just a lot of the capability of this pedal crosses paths with the HM2, but it is very different, especially if you put them side by side. So just because you're happy with, turning the little black and orange box all the way up to 10 on every control doesn't count this thing out entirely, as it does a hell of a lot more than that. So take a brief tour of the controls and kind of show you how I tend to dial this in, and the kind of things that you have to tame to be able to achieve a controlled and audibly pleasant yet still nasty blown out wall sound. So initially, this looks fairly intimidating with all of the controls, especially them not being labeled until you hover your mouse over it. I think this was kind of a good move, though, because it makes things more clear. And ultimately, the control scheme boils down into a few sections of frequency response EQ before and after the distortion. You have some simple in and out levels. You have your primary distortion controls, and that's basically it, other than a clean blend option, which over here is all the way maxed out. Nothing but the pedal. Over here is completely clean, and over here is something in between where you'll have the clean DI coming in before this pedal, going into whatever you have going after it. So even if you don't want to take full advantage of this pedal's capability and you just want a little different grit going into an already fairly overdriven amplifier, it's pretty easy to make that happen with just a mix control and a couple input and output levels, even if you're just sticking with the factory presets, which are a really good start if you're feeling overwhelmed with this because it's easy to do. So in the center, you have the input or output level monitor. You can switch between them with the foot switch. One side shows you the level coming in, the other shows you the level coming out, which the output level can be very, very important for this, as it really determines how much output volume is going into the front of the amplifier sim. Of course, if you just use this with a cab IR, which is not its intention, you kind of use this as a master volume control. But nonetheless, if you want most of your distortion sound to come from this pedal, then you'll want to turn the output level down probably decently below unity gain, because otherwise it's going to just destroy the front end of whatever preamplifier, even if it's relatively clean sounding without it, though that can be desirable. So you'll definitely want to play with the relationship between the distortions and the output. Likewise, the input is determining how hot the signal is that comes into this distortion circuit, and it reacts very differently depending on what level of input you have. Some of the more voltage-starved fuzz sounding settings definitely gate out if you have the input too low, and there is definitely a sweet spot for me where I don't want it too overly saturated. I want to have a little bit of that Velcro rip texture to many of these settings. And then there's other times like this where I just want it completely slammed and totally liquid sounding. So very important controls that otherwise are not very glamorous, but they definitely shape this pedal in a fundamental way. Two other basic controls that can't really be emulated or undone in any other way are the high pass and low pass filters, which sound like are in two different spots of the circuit. I believe the high pass filter is very early on in the distortion signal chain, if not before the distortion entirely, and the low pass filter is going to be after the distortion. And you can kind of hear that as turning up the high pass filter tightens up the distortion. It does start to lose a little bit of aggressiveness as a lot of the signal is dialed out, but this could be really important if you're using a down-tuned or baritone or extended range guitar and you want to retain some level of pick articulation and not just be a total washed out mess. This can really be useful between like 100 and 200 hertz a lot of the times. Likewise, the low pass filter is pretty important to control the amount of excess fizz going into any amplifier circuit. After this, I tend to low pass anywhere between like 5,000 and 8,000 hertz for a lot of typical scenarios where there's a lot of treble content and harmonics being generated already. So for this, you typically won't want to leave this completely wide open, but maybe if you have a super dark preamp channel or you've dialed in a dark impulse response, this could come in handy. So I would start with these around, the 5 to 10,000 hertz settings, and if you need a little bit more high frequency content, come here first before you start messing with any of the other EQ controls. Of course, you can defeat those entirely if you want to just let this circuit do all of its thing completely wide open. The EQ controls at the top very much seem to share that same philosophy, as there is a triad of controls dedicated to a post EQ boost or cut. You have the gain here, the frequency selection here, which can go from 250 all the way up to 2.5K, and the Q factor of the filter. The other controls seem to be right before or in the midst of the multiple gain stages, where you have a tone with the same frequency and Q factor controls, and a low level that only allows you to change the Q and the overall volume. You don't actually get to pick the frequency, which leads me to believe this is either some type of shelving filter or a band filter that is situated at a guitar frequency that there's really not a whole lot of frequency content below it. So ultimately it's going to behave roughly the same. Once you start tweaking with these, even at the same distortion settings, this pedal starts to sound very different because it's highlighting and crushing a lot of these tonal frequencies, which go between 120 and 2.5K. And that's where a lot of those HM2 style tones can come from, especially with a relatively steep Q and a 12 to 15 decibel boost on some of those vocal mid to high mid frequencies. You can get really ice picky too if you're not careful. And that is part of the unique sound of this pedal. Likewise, you can do the same thing at the post and kind of give it that dual Batman ear hump, as I like to call it, or you can completely scoop it out and make things sound more contemporary in both cases. You can use this as subtractive EQ to kind of build your own boost. You can use it as additive EQ. You can do a combination of the two, and it really changes the way the distortion circuit reacts, which the big knob in the center is where you control the overall distortion, which seems to be very sensitive to level, as I said earlier. And you can go anywhere from just a, relatively light fuzz crunch to totally saturated and basically square wave. So all those things interact with one another, and there's really not much more than experimentation to do to figure out where those boundaries lay. And that's part of the fun here. Finally, below that control, you have a pair of tube controls for the drive and mix of that circuit, which sounds like it's in series to the overall distortion circuit, but I can't be for sure. There's a lot going on here, so it very well could be in parallel or some mix of the two. Knowing Otto audio, anything is possible. Whatever the case, it seems to bring on a bit of light compression and some of the, brighter, harsher harmonics that we associate with overdriven preamp tubes. It is something that I tend to go lightly on if I'm already pushing a, preamplifier simulation like the 1111, but it is really cool, especially if you have a mostly clean preamp or you just want to add to something that doesn't have any preamp emulation at all. Definitely brings its own thing. I tend to like dialing these in conjunction, though. There's really not a setting where I like this distortion super low and this one super high. They kind of all like to play well with one another in my experience. So there's really no extreme opposites or any range that you have to look out for where it just doesn't work at all. You can tell there's been a lot of thought in this to make sure that every setting, even if it doesn't sound right for whatever you're using it for in that moment, it can sound right. Well, totally wrong, but that is right in this case for something. So with that, I'll show you a few of the tricks up this thing's sleeve. I won't go even remotely into some of the capabilities of this because I'm not a huge classic fuzz type player, nothing like any fuzz faces or basically any of the silicon based circuits. I'm not really big into that. So mostly this is just going to be rip your face off, kind of nasty, Velcro-y, rippy type of sound. So if you like 1111, you'll probably like this too. And that's basically going to do it for today's sound check. A big thanks to Reed from Otto Audio for sending this thing over for me to play with as always, and thank you, as always, for checking out this video. As far as recommendations goes, at its base price of $100, there's part of me that thinks this is a little steep. That thinks that this is a really specialized tool that I don't know that a lot of people are going to get their money's worth out of it on the surface. And then you look at what, HM2s are going for, what some of the real life circuits are going for, and for how much the 1111 can do for its price point. There is this other part of my brain that says, well, if you're using that to its full potential and this is just like that sound that you've not heard before, it's probably well worth it for a lot of people. And especially with the sale price of closer to $70 US, then I have a little bit of an easier time recommending it. But where this is such a character-driven tone, I don't think many people are going to plug into this and that's going to be their tone for the band. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, but I think this is going to be something that's a little more specialized than 1111 would be, and especially all of the impulse response packs that they've put out so far. So if you work with a lot of synths or do some sound design where something like this can really come in handy, I think it makes a lot of sense and could very well complement some of the more traditional distortion type designer plugins out there. From a simple metal guitar player's point of view, though, I would probably treat this just like I would treat one of my myriad of distortion or wacky fuzz pedals, something like one of those up there where, yeah, I plug into it maybe, once every other month or so and have a little spin with it, and I'll go, oh, that sounds cool, and that inspires me to write this, and then maybe I'll record with it on the channel and almost certainly won't ever use it on an actual song for anything that I would consider to be my sound, but I still like to have it. So if you're of that mindset and you enjoy the VST plugin space and enjoy using these things on your computer or Mac, then it's very easy to recommend. But for a lot of people that just want a high gain tone, and especially one of more contemporary variety, if a Mad Amp or Sun amplifiers or the HM2 doesn't come to mind when you think high gain guitar tones, then this probably isn't going to be up your alley. But with that, hopefully we will see you sooner rather than later with some more upcoming Otto Audio releases that I hear about. And thank you so very much for watching. Leave any questions down below, and I'll see you next time. Bye.